Hello, thanks for joining me on this week's 172nd Air Wing video. Today we have for review one of my favorites, the F-4E Phantom II. This one is in the colors of the Islamic Republic of Iran Air Force out of the 61st Tactical Fighter Squadron, roundabouts 2010. And this F-4 is representative of a line of aircraft that has had a relatively influential service period that many people in the West are not aware of. I can say with some certainty that as an American who did some research on this video by reading Tom Cooper's F-4E history book from Iranian service, as well as his book that he did on the F-14 in Iranian service, it's safe to say that there's a lot of facts about the F-4 service which will be news to many of you watching this. I can tell you as a person doing the research, it was certainly news to me. So the F-4 story, most of us are probably familiar with if you're watching this. So originally the F-4 got its start as a fleet defense fighter with the US Navy. Robert McNamara made the decision in 1961 to have the Air Force trial the F-4 as flown by the Navy against the F-105 as operated by the US Air Force, as well as the F-106. And as a result of the trials, the F-4, at the time the F-4B Phantom II came out on top as the highest performing aircraft ever built at the West at that point in history. So the US Air Force made an order in 1962 for the F-4 Air Force variant, which had a few changes, but for the most part was fairly similar to the US Navy variant, and that would go on to serve in Vietnam, of course, as well as other areas of the Southeast Asian theater. Some of the lessons that were learned from that were then integrated into the F-4E variant, which is representative here at 1/72nd scale by HobbyMaster's release here. And the F-4E differed from the earlier Navy version in that the nose incorporated a cannon. So right here, roughly around about midway of the nose, the barrel would come out about here. Obviously the lead would come out a lot faster here, and the drum would be located right about here behind the radar. And that was one of the largest changes that were made to the original F-4 version. Some other changes that were made: the fuel tank was added to the back in order to balance against the inclusion of the cannon in the front, as well as the deletion of the emergency ram air turbine there in order to compensate for the different balance of weight. We also see here this little nub. We'll talk to that a little bit later in the review, but this part right here, this little orifice here, represents a TIZIO. So that is a telescoping electro-optical sensor. And what that was used for was in instances when the F-4 would carry a BVR loadout of AIM-7 Sparrows, the F-4 would use the radar lock from the radar front, pass that information to the TIZIO, and then this would basically act as a massive zoom camera, allowing the weapons systems officer sitting in the back to look through the viewfinder and to visually identify the targeted aircraft. And that would of course be used to engage or disengage as necessary. The invention of electronic identification means from longer range, such as the Vietnam era combat tree, more or less rendered the TIZIO aspect obsolete as time went on. But in the 1970s, this technology was pretty much as good as it got when it came to identification, friend or foe, beyond visual technology, or should I say beyond visual range. It should be noted here too that the F-14 maintained a similar system on the F-14B and the later version of the F-14D, in that the chin pod in the front carried both, sometimes, an infrared sensor as well as a visual sensor. So when the RIO was locked on with an AIM-54, they could get a visual identification of what they were about to shoot at. So all this technology in the updated F-4E variant made its way to Iran early in the 1970s. This is a bit hard to believe for many people born and raised in the modern geopolitical environment, but in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, Iran more or less occupied the role in U.S. foreign policy that the alliance with Israel holds today. They were our largest regional ally, and in fact, whenever there were new aircraft or technologies introduced, Iran was always almost the first export customer to take delivery. So this was true of the F-14. This was also true of the Northrop F-5. I believe Iran and, if memory serves, the Netherlands, the two of them were very close in terms of coming to initial operating capability of the F-5. And this was also the case for the F-4. So Iran was one of the few countries to ever be exported the pre-F-4E version, meaning the version that did not have the cannon. So the F-4D was exported to Iran and was used in the mid-1970s to support the Sultan of Oman during an expeditionary mission to repress a rebellion in that country. In 1971, based off of positive results from that expedition, the Shah of Iran ordered 208 F-4Es, and being that the Shah of Iran enjoyed a close relationship with both the British and the American defense establishment, the order for the F-4 were approved, and Iran became one of the top importers of the F-4 and the top operators at the time. So in fact, Iran was one of the first countries to operate this and even beat Israel to the operating table in terms of standing up their F-4E capability. So in 1971, an order of 177 Phantom 2s 208 were ordered. Out of the 208 through the 1970s, 177 were eventually delivered through 1979. In 1979, once again, as many of you know, the Iranian Revolution took place. So in the course of that massive political change, the Shah of Iran, due to disenchantment with his egregious human rights and financial misappropriations and various other crimes, which is definitely a topic for a different day, the Iranian people were fed up with his nonsense and revolted. So in 1979, the pro-Western Iranian monarchy was overthrown, and 31 F-4Es, which were scheduled to be delivered to Iran, were held back as part of the American embargo on Iranian military equipment, an embargo which here and now in 2023 still stands to this day. So during the upheaval of the 1979 revolution, a lot of unpleasant things happened, and one of them was a distrust of the Air Force by the Iranian Islamic government. So when the Islamic government centralized power, they viewed anything that was favored by the Shah as a political liability, and unfortunately, the Imperial Iranian Air Force was a military branch that enjoyed large support, both financial and personal, from the Shah. The Shah of Iran, unusual for many world leaders, was in fact a qualified pilot, and there is a photo of the Shah taking a backseat ride in an F-4D. So being an active pilot, he of course took a great interest in the Air Force, which was something that came to be recognized as a political problem when the Shah was deposed. His deposition in 1979 meant that many senior officers of the former Imperial Iranian Air Force recognized the writing on the wall and left before the regime could get to them, which meant that the few officers still left in the Iranian military establishment were looked upon with grave suspicion, and many of them were in fact arrested, tried, some in fact executed for perceived or actual political crimes. So this sort of treatment of the military was not unnoticed. Next door in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, ever the nice guy apparently in geopolitical terms, took note of his neighbor's unstable military position. In the earlier times of things, an Iraqi attack of Iran would have been political and financial suicide because the Shah was arming up his country to deter any potential aggression from a much bigger military, which was the Soviet Union, which Iran at the time directly bordered. So fearing that the Soviet Union would one day invade his country and make an attempt to seize Iranian oil, the Shah invested heavily in the military during his tenure. And this strategic concern was also brought about by the fact that back in the 20s, when the Kahar dynasty ran Iran, the Russians and the British had jointly split the country and turned it into an imperial outpost. So, fearing a return to the old ways of the early 20th century, the Shah armored up his military, both in the air and in the ground, to ensure that the Soviet Union could not make an invasion attempt to take the country. So, and this was, of course, something that the United States strategic and political establishment definitely supported. So once the Iranian military started suffering difficulties due to political purges, officers leaving, being defecting, or being executed, or sometimes all of the above, Saddam Hussein, ever the opportunist, looked at this state of affairs and thought this was his chance to become a regional power. The way his logic broke out is if he invaded Iran and seized the country and overthrew the clerical government, he would win favor from the Arabs and he would win favor from the West in one fell master stroke. Because it also must be considered that the faction of Islam that took over Iran is not a faction that other Arab nations such as Saudi Arabia happen to favor. And a deposition of the Iranian government would have served the political interest of many Muslim governments in the area. So with that geopolitical background in place, Saddam invaded the country of Iran in September 1980, starting the Iran-Iraq War. So during this war, the F-4 played a key role in supporting and defending Iranian positions, both in close air support missions, directly destroying Iraqi armor and military positions, and the F-4s were also used in many interdiction missions, some of which were actually pretty darn amazing from a military perspective. Those of you that have seen Top Gun Maverick by now, of course, know that in that movie, and I'm going to give away the plot because the movie's been out for some years now, and if you're watching videos on scale model military aircraft, you probably know the plot by heart yourself anyway, so consider yourself warned. Here's your last chance if you haven't seen Top Gun Maverick yet. But in essence, the plot of that movie is there's a raid that Maverick has to lead on a rogue nation that's developing nuclear weapons. And as much as that's entertaining for movie purposes, missions like that have actually happened in real life. Now, of course, some of you are aware that the Israelis did launch an operation later on to attack and destroy the Tammuz reactor in Iraq. Say that 3 times fast. But before this happened, the Iranians used F-4Es, not too dissimilar from this one, to attack it first. So the initial attempt by Iraq to gain nuclear weapons capability was in the middle of the 1980s, which is, of course, a time when the Iran-Iraq war was definitely ongoing. And for obvious reasons, Iranian headquarters did not want Saddam Hussein to get a nuke. And interestingly enough, this was a point that brought the Islamic government of Iran and the decidedly anti-Islamic government of Israel into some geopolitical accord. So by making some back-channel negotiations and deals, the Israelis provided intelligence support to the Iranians, who then launched a strike mission to attack and damage the reactor, which they successfully did, contrary to what some people have claimed on the internet. Based on Tom Cooper's book, the attack on the Tammuz reactor by the IRIAF F-4E Phantoms were successful. They did it at extraordinarily low level and in total radio silence, which is very hard to do. Those of you who have played DCS know full and well what I mean. So, yeah, they pulled off some pretty amazing strikes there. The F-4E was also used in Iranian capacity to attack the Iraqi H-3 airfield, which is located closer to Israel than it is to Tehran. So in a move to preserve their aircraft, the Iraqis stationed many of their aircraft to H-3, correctly estimating that the refueling range of the Iranian F-4s was too low to permit a strike mission on that airfield. The Iranians also did the math and realized that attacking this airfield was going to be logistically difficult, but they also knew that the quantities of aircraft and material at H3 could not be allowed to stand, because of course it would obviously be used against them in a later offensive. So to attack the airfield, the Iranians drafted a very daring plan, which was to take off in radio silence of 2 flights of 4 F-4s apiece, so 8 F-4E Phantoms, took off fully loaded with bombs, not too much different than what you see right here in this model, and they would travel the distance from eastern Iran to eastern Iraq over Turkish airspace at low level, and they also refueled at low level from Iranian KC-747 tankers. As I understand it, the only 747s to ever be built as tankers from the factory were the variants operated by the Iranian Air Force. At the time, they were, of course, the Imperial Iranian Air Force, and to this day, no other country operates a 747 tanker. So these tankers were flown at extraordinarily low level, below 1,000 feet, and these F-4s had to line up behind the KC-747 tankers and take on fuel in radio silence to make the mission happen. If they had made any mistakes or come up on Turkish or Iraqi radar, the mission would be, of course, a frightful disaster all around. But the pilots flew to H3, dropped their bombs. One of the 8 Phantoms took a hit and had to make an emergency landing when it struggled back to Iranian airspace, but nobody was lost. The damaged aircraft was repaired and put back into service. And overall, the H3 raid was a pretty amazing success, all things considered. H3 will come back to this channel later on because I do have the FA-18C flown by Mongo, and on a mission that would happen about half a decade after this initial raid on H3, this time involving the US and the NATO coalition. We're going to talk about Mongo's mid-kill and his mission to that same H3 airfield and when his squadron attacked it sometime later. But returning to the subject of the F-4E, it's very obvious to know, of course, that this aircraft had quite a distinguished heritage and participated in many, many other missions, ranging from air superiority to obviously air-to-ground interdiction, as well as battlefield close air support and reconnaissance in the form of the RF-4E variants. One of the comments that is worth sharing from Tom Cooper's book on the Iranian F-4 service is how many of the IRIAF pilots felt that it was a question not necessarily of whether they would survive the war, but whether they would be tortured by the prisoner of war camps of Saddam Hussein, or they would be tortured by the political torture camps run by the Islamic government in their own country. It's not a position that I've ever had to think about as somebody who was in the U.S. Air Force active duty, but I had to make note of this because it's one thing to fight for your country and know that your country supports what you're doing. It's another thing to strap on an airplane, go up and risk your life to defend your country when it's a coin flip of whether or not you'll be tortured by your own government or the government that you're attacking who is attacking your country. It's a strange political scenario, and under the circumstances, I'm amazed that the Iranian pilots performed as well as they did. And that's something worth pointing out when talking about the history of the IRIAF F-4s. So that all covered, let's shift to the model itself. So as some of you may have already picked up on, I did add some light weathering to the model. So bear in mind that when you do take delivery of this, it is not going to have the weathering shown here and in some of the introductory shots that I did earlier. I did add some weathering to it just because that's a little bit more reflective of the condition of the F-4E, of this particular serial, I should say, circa 2010, and using some reference photos to get that look. So to me, an airplane that's been flown in actual combat needs to reflect it, and having an airplane that looks completely museum clean is a little unrealistic in the real world, you know? They only look that clean when the generals are coming around to do inspections, you know? So, with that discussed, we'll shift to pointing out the qualities of the model. So overall, the good parts about it are The stenciling and the paint quality from HobbyMaster is really well done. We don't see any mistakes with the demarcation line between the lower gray section and the camouflage. There's no paint errors with the camouflage sections. Your Tizio is marked and in the appropriate place. The slats are modeled correctly. The leading edge of the stabilators are modeled correctly. Also, the shark nose looks really well done on this, and I do like the fact that they painted it on this model pretty well. And the ordnance is realistic to the period in question. The Iranian Air Force F-4s are pretty much frozen in about a mid-1980s condition just because of the whole embargo. So we don't see anything in the way of targeting pods or advanced IFF systems or any of the external changes like the IFF antenna in the nose that you'll see on the South Korean or the Hellenic Air Force F-4s, which are of course substantially modernized. So these being in 1980s shape means you're going to see pretty much old school weaponry, which we do see here in the Mark 82s. These have the daisy cutter fuses fitted, so these are designed for anti-personnel purposes, meaning the bomb hits the fuse here, fuse triggers the bomb explodes without going into the ground, and it does more damage to deployed troops in an open environment, which it's hard to really say which weapons the IRIAF F-4s used just because they basically used all of them. This would count as a valid loadout. However, I would have liked to see something like 2 AGM-65s. There was a photo I did see of 3 at one point, but with the F-4Es, usually they carry just 2 because the interaction of the third one caused a lot of drag, which generally hurt fuel economy enough to where most of the time when F-4s took off with AGM-65s loaded, they generally just had 2, one here and one here. So I would have liked to see that on this. I would have also liked to have seen a longer ALQ-101A ECM pod. You do get a QRC-160, which is like the Vietnam era old school ECM pods. They did use those, so I'm not too terribly upset about that, but I would have again liked to see an ALQ-101, which would have been a more reflective of the technology that Iran was using. They did, of course, have the QRC-160s, but that wasn't the only ECM that the Iranians used on their Phantoms. And of course, the AIM-9s are modeled pretty well. I would have again liked to have seen those be modeled after the AIM-9Js, which were the imported versions, not the AIM-9Bs that you see here. However, for the purposes of the model, it pretty much does work. You're talking about white heat-seeking missiles either way, so I'm not too terribly out of joint about that, but it would have been nice to see some more variety and variation in those loadouts. So the paint quality again is really well done. The stenciling, such as what you see here, and on the panels is done really well. Panel line markings also are in good condition, and the Persian numerals in the front reflecting the serial number aren't messy or muddled or crooked, so it's great to see that too. The stenciling and the warning, as well as the canopy and rescue access ports, are done very well, and the slime lights, aka the formation lights here and here, are also modeled accurately too. So you will see that smudge right there. That's just me doing some weathering to indicate, the cooling vent that's at the base of the fin there, and even the location of the formation light, as well as the airspeed, as well as the communication antenna, is also done right there as well. So all in all, I think HobbyMaster did a really good job with the paint. Would have been nice to see on the inside of the intakes right about here, would have been nice to see some white, or shall I say like cream colored lining on the inside of the intakes right in there, right where my pen's pointing. Generally on the real aircraft, you will see a color scheme similar to this right here, where the inside of the intakes is painted a off-white color, and that's pretty universal of all of the Phantoms. So this is something that Air Commander does take into account with their models, but on the HobbyMaster one, like you see here, the back and the interior is basically the same color as the rest of the camouflage. So that is just something to point out. It would be nice to see them update that in the future. But overall, I do happen to like the paint quality and the color scheme, as well as the quality of the markings and the stencils. So we talked about the TISO earlier. You do get 2 fuel tanks. These are also accurately colored. The Sergeant Fletcher branded fuel tanks were made for basically all of the export Phantoms, and all of the export Phantoms, regardless of country of destination, use the Southeast Asian colors. So the Southeast Asian colors, you just have your dark green on top, and then you have your light colored off-white paint on the bottom. It doesn't matter if you're talking about a Greek, Australian, Israeli, or Iranian F-4, all of them used this color. So I'm glad to see that they got that right. As a note on the Israeli ones, as time went on, they did get around to painting their external fuel tanks in a matching desert color scheme with the rest of their F-4s, but initially, upon delivery, they did have the same color scheme. So if you are building an Israeli F-4 and it's circa 1973, 1974, somewhere in there, or earlier, you'll want to use the dark green color for your external fuel tanks instead of mirroring the camouflage of the aircraft as was done later. So overall, I think this is a really good model. I like it. And of course, it's hard to really avoid the subject of just how despicable the Islamic regime has been, especially lately. But the story that I want to focus on is not the machinations of a group of retentive, greedy-ass, freaking religious crooks turn the country into their own private piggy bank with everything. The story to talk about is the sacrifice of the pilots who flew this and are still flying it today. Iran is one of the 4 countries that are still operating the F-4 Phantom II in frontline service. So it is worth pointing out that the Phantom is not fully retired yet. This airplane is still very much in service, which is kind of amazing. It really shows you just what kind of adaptability this airplane brings to the table when greater than 57 years after this variant first flew in 1969, it is still in frontline service with South Korea, Iran, the Hellenic Air Force in Greece, and Turkey. So recently, as you may have noticed in my other video, I covered the Japanese Air Defense Force, who recently retired their F-4 Phantoms in 2020. So still a very formidable airplane, and it's kind of amazing that in the last 57 something years, we've gone from Mach 2 and making needle nose pointy high-speed airplanes, just figuring out how Mach 2 flight works. And we've gone all the way to stealth and low observability and high technology, sensor fusion and all that. And despite all those advances, the F-4 is still trucking on, still flying, and still serving to this day, which is a real testament to how amazing and capable this design is. So, it'll be some time before I suspect all of them will be retired. And it says something that the F-4 has outlived so many airplanes that came after it and were supposedly, at least in terms of like kinematics or, performance or, some other aspect better. So it'll be interesting to see how the story ends for Iran. I'm curious to see because I don't think the Iranian regime as it is now is going to last, not in the world of social media. And eventually, whether from without or within, it's going away, I think. Hopefully, the Iranian people will be the ones to make that decision, and I hope that's how it turns out. I certainly don't want the U.S. or any other country going in and making a decision for them. That's mostly been the biggest problem with that country for the last 100-odd years, are foreign powers making decisions for the people of Iran. And in some ways, the situation we see now with the Islamic regime is a consequence of that foreign intervention, and the Iranians picked the regime that they thought would be the most resistant to being taken over or usurped by a foreign power. And, we see how that decision turned out. So hopefully that political situation stabilizes internally for the better. And who knows, maybe we'll see some more footage of the F-4s when the Islamic government is gone and a better Islamic government or better Iranian government is running the show. And, Iran can join the panel of nations without having to hang their heads in shame at what their country's become. So with that, we will conclude the video here. At this point, this model is still relatively available. So definitely go out and check it out if you're interested in adding it to your collection, even if you are, an American or somebody who like me, has no love for the Islamic regime, definitely consider adding it to your collection anyway, especially if you're an F-4 fan, because there's so much history with these aircraft, and the fact that the U.S. trained these pilots, and in very trying circumstances they came through to defend their country, even when their own government literally locked them up at gunpoint and sometimes executed their friends. So out of respect for that, I do display this. So you may have noticed some dust in the model. I did try to clean up as much as I could before shooting footage, but if you see some dust in the corners and crevices there, I'll issue an apology in advance for that. But that's one of the reasons why I do display it as a ode of respect to the members of of the Iranian Air Force that stood up and defended their country, even when their own government didn't want to defend them. So again, if you want to pick these up, they're still available at relatively reasonable prices around this time. So at the time of spring 2023, these are selling for relatively decent prices, about $100-something, brand new from various retailers. So don't wait. Don't wait for them to start selling out and the prices to go up. It's not usually the good place to be when you're trying to get a model. So, if you are interested in a comprehensive Phantom collection, definitely don't pass this one up. So thank you for watching. If you like my video today, consider looking at my other ones on my channel. Those of you who have subscribed to my channel, thank you very much for the support, and it is definitely appreciated. Those of you who have made your points known in the comments section, keep it up. I like and will interact with you guys as best as my schedule allows. So I can't promise I will react immediately to posts and questions, but I do read them all and I do respond as best I can. So with that, consider subscribing. That way, if and when I do release a new video every Sunday morning, you will be notified through the YouTube app, and you can click it and see the latest video. So hopefully that's what brought you here. If not, once again, consider subscribing, and then you'll be on the list to know when I upload my newest weekly video. And thank you again for